We're here with the Reverend Janine Schenone.
Janine, yeah.
Janine.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here this evening. So my first question for you is, as a bishop, who in your past or present would be your personal role model? And what do you find most admirable in their style of life and leadership?
Is that as a bishop?
Yes.
Does that mean a bishop who's a role model, or if I were bishop, who would be my role model?
If you were to be bishop, who would be your role model?
Okay. Probably the person who comes to mind most prominently is Catherine Jefford Shorey, who stepped in as an assisting bishop in San Diego when our bishop, Jim Mathis, left to take an academic position. And so she has been my bishop for about a year and a half. And one of the things that I find admirable about her is that we have a lot in common in that we have a very reasonable way of approaching things. In other words, if you think of the Myers-Briggs personality, ENTP, for example, the T part, the focusing on the facts and the information and making sure you have it. But at the same time, if you go through life handling things that way, you ignore the feeling side of things, which is where many people are in their spiritual lives and their worship lives. So one of the things I really admire about her is that although she processes things that way, she does not emit them that way necessarily. And so what I found in her is a wonderful mix of a person who's always interested in learning and exploring and finding out, and also engaging the world in an exceedingly pastoral manner. It is a manner that is inviting to both lay people and clergy alike. She cares for everybody equally. She is an outstanding listener who would prefer to listen rather than to offer counsel. And she was an encourager to me when several people were, including strangers, that's a long story, were telling me to put my name in for bishop positions, and I thought that was a silly suggestion. And I went to her, and she encouraged me as well, and has been with me on that journey, providing me with a listening ear. And I'll get a text every now and then from her saying, thinking of you, praying for you, hope it's going well, be yourself, have a blast. If you know anything about her history, you also know that she became the presiding bishop at a difficult time in the church's history. She dealt with a tremendous amount of conflict, which is something that bishops need to do. And she handled it with aplomb, and she doesn't take things personally. And in my ministry, I found that it goes smoothly and there's joy for everybody if we engage conflict lovingly, kindly, intently, without fear. I'm kind of at the pace that people can handle engaging in the conflict. Because if we let it simmer, or smolder is probably the better way, it will erupt into a fire. But if we address it carefully, kind of at the pace that people can handle, then communities can go through tremendous transformation. I think she brought the wider Episcopal Church through that transformation with tremendous grace.
Thank you. Your next question, what has been your experience with using community organizing tools to seek ways to engage and minister with people outside the walls of the church? And would you encourage the Episcopal Diocese of El Camino Real to further embrace community organizing? Very wordy, so I'll hand that to you.
Thank you. My experience has been with community organizing has been in two locations at All Saints Pasadena, which has a long history of community organizing. Our staff and our 4,000 member church worked with many community partners, the police department across the street, the mayor's office across the street, Planned Parenthood, the synagogue, faith partners, to work on things such as higher wages for city employees, gun safety, fair treatment of Black and brown people in Pasadena, avoiding police violence and things like that. But then when I got to San Diego, I joined the San Diego Organizing Project, which is a PICO affiliate. So there's a very active PICO affiliate here. more than one actually in the Bay Area. In fact, I've worked with people from the Faith in Action or the PICO affiliates here when they have come down to San Diego for border things. We have worked on a variety of things. Black Lives Matters questions in San Diego. The border issue that I described in my opening statements, as well as gun safety issues after the shooting at Marjorie Stone at Douglas High School. My congregation, which I would not call highly geared up for social action or what people term social justice, came to me. They know that I sort of do it as my side job, and they said, we want to march for our lives. I said, okay, we'll get signed up. So I became a part of San Diegans for Gun Violence Prevention. And I had 18 members of my church in our bright green shirts marching at March for Our Lives. We were the largest single church contingent. There were lots of church people, but we were the largest contingent that I know of at that march. And afterwards we went out to lunch, and almost everybody at the table was very proud. A lot of them were in their 70s, and they said, this is the first march I've ever gone to. I would definitely encourage Il Camino Real to further embrace community organizing, but I would go beyond what has been the traditional understanding of it and look at a wider community. And that wider community would be the high-tech culture here, the wealth of that culture, the innovation of that culture, the genius of that culture, and say, if we're so good at creating the latest app that will get me a car to the airport, let's solve the housing crisis. The housing crisis has been caused by the burgeoning wealth in the Silicon Valley companies.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
As bishop, another question that starts as bishop, what would you do to address shrinking, aging congregations that are moving toward unsustainability? We
had a very similar question last night. I'm going to just stand up just so I feel like I'm kind of a kinetic speaker, or kinesthetic speaker. This situation is affecting all houses of worship across all denominations and even religions. And so there's nothing specific to the Episcopal tradition that causes this. At the same time, a lot of times a shrinking, aging congregation can happen because of demographic issues. Issues such as an industry having left the area, or so that people leave the area as well. Or something like the cost of housing in the Bay Area that is causing our younger adults and young families to move out of the area to someplace where they can afford a mortgage. So I think when we look at congregations that are moving towards unsustainability, which usually means they can't afford to pay their fair share or pay their rent or whatever, then we need to ask ourselves, is there a viable mission in the neighborhood? If there are people to serve, people with a need, and the people in the church could meet that need, then let's help them do that. Or if they don't feel called to do that, then ask that group of people, what is it that you do feel called to do? Because it has to be more than arriving for church on Sunday and experiencing Episcopal worship. That is beauty, and it feeds us and it heals us, but then we need to go out and do something in our world. And so what I would do as bishop is work with a diocesan team as well as leaders of the church in strategic planning process to ask them, what is on your heart in ways that you could serve other people? What is it that you get out of this community that somebody else around here could get out of this community? It might mean moving the church community. It might mean ending it. But even if that were to happen, I, as bishop, and the members of this diocese, we have a responsibility for the care of those souls. So if we were to decide that it weren't viable, then we would have to figure out a way to give them a rich spiritual experience wherever they may go.
Thank you. Next, what might be your vision of working with a council of deacons rather than with an archdeacon? And what is your vision of how the diaconate in ECR might develop and expand?
Oh, I love this question. In general, and this has a lot to do with my being raised up as a leader in high-tech companies, a lot of software companies, Intuit, Novell, Netflix, and so on. I find that the best work comes out of collaboration with a group of people. because you have diversity of thought and diversity of creativity and invention. And also, it's a lot more fun. It's a less top-down understanding of the way that you manage things. And so anything that can happen through the consensus of a diverse group of people is often magic making, whether it's in industry or in church. So if we had a council of deacons, I would expect that council to be driving a lot of innovation in the way we nurture and develop the diaconate. But one of the ways that we could develop the diaconate is to have a far more linguistic diversity in the diaconate. So I was speaking to somebody yesterday, actually I was speaking to 2 people yesterday about their sense of vocation. One of them, Latina, speaks Spanish and said that she had thought and prayed about it for years and has free time, could serve the church in many, many ways. What was I going to do? Could I in any way help, this is all happening in Spanish by the way, help young children to see that they might have a vocation in the church? And I said, yes, they need ejemplos, they need examples like you. You could be a deacon, you could be a diácona. I said, oh, I don't know. And I said, oh, yes, you could. In San Diego, we have far fewer deacons than you have here. It's something we need to work on. And almost no Latina deacons. We just got our first one. And the way we made this happen is that we had to work on providing translation of materials and class sessions for her. She lives in Yuma, Arizona. The School for Ministry is in San Diego, way to the west, on the coast, right near Tijuana. And she couldn't get there for the Saturday classes all the time. And she also couldn't read the more complex materials. If you've ever, in English, if you've ever read theology, you know that you can't do that and have a language barrier as well. So things were translated for her. They Zoomed her into the classes so that she could be present and have somebody translating while the professor was lecturing or leading a discussion, translating people's comments as well. And she was ordained about 6 months ago, our first Latina deacon. That is how the diaconate and ECR could expand and develop.
Thank you. Another wordy one. Many of our parishes have implemented and practiced open communication in which all, no matter where they are in their spiritual journey, are welcome to receive communion. Please discuss your position on open communion. What would your directions to diocesan clergy be on the issue?
Okay, that's another direction question. There was a night when they just kept having, what directives would you give, what directions? And in general, I think bishops are less likely to direct and send out directives and more likely to counsel and encourage. My personal position on open communion is that when I say the Eucharistic prayer and somebody comes up with their hands out and I say the body of Christ, the bread of heaven, and they say they want it, then I can't see myself saying you can't have Jesus. In all the churches where in the first church where I served as a priest, the rector announced at the beginning all baptized Christians are welcome to receive communion. So that was the position there. But in my second church, the bishop of LA at the time had given all clergy in the diocese permission to do open communion because of the pastoral application that General Convention had allowed. In other words, if you think that for pastoral reasons you should allow people communion, then go ahead. So I was quite used to that. And then when I got to Good Samaritan in San Diego, where I am the rector, people said to me, you are going to allow it, right? You are going to allow it. You aren't you? So I don't disallow it. I mean, I'm pretty busy consecrating and making sure the acolytes are doing what they're doing, and then people come up for communion. I say the body of Christ, the bread of heaven, and they say, let me have it. I give it to them. I don't check their ID. As a bishop, what I would suggest to priests is that we honor what General Convention has decided. And what General Convention decided was that the priests, the deacons, and the laity wanted open communion and the bishops did not, as I understand it. That's what happened at the last one. But they also said that if you have pastoral reasons for offering it, then go ahead. So what I would suggest to people is that if you have pastoral reasons, if you have a church full of seekers who don't understand the barrier to communion, the baptism as a barrier, then that is a legitimate pastoral reason. At the same time, if you as a priest feel that it's very important to wait until people are baptized because there's important formation that goes on before that, because there's a sense of claiming Christianity through baptism, then I would encourage them to have that policy in their church. And I think that the wider church has given us the freedom in its findings at General Convention to do that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Just get some water.
Oh, yeah. Your final question. Please tell us about your theology and practice of Christian stewardship and your views about the biblical tithe. Do you personally practice the tithe? Would you put a priority on energizing attitudes about stewardship? And how would you as bishop do this as bishop of ECR?
I do personally practice the tithe. I started doing that as a Franciscan. And I thought of stopping it once because I just wanted more money. And my Franciscan spiritual mentor wrote back, I said, I'm thinking of not doing 10%, 5% maybe. And she wrote back one word, why? And I thought, I can't answer that question. I was saving for a daughter to go to college, and I was just so afraid that I wouldn't have enough. And you always want to sock away more for yourself and your kid. And a funny thing happened. My daughter changed where she was going to college, and even though I thought I hadn't put enough away, by the time my daughter graduated from college, with financial aid, with that, with this, with that, her scholarships and so on, I ended up with $400 left in her college savings account, even though I hadn't socked away what I thought was enough. I do believe that if we give generously, that God provides, not necessarily by giving all that money back, but in another way. It is hard to figure out 10% of what, like if you're paying taxes and if you're putting money to 403B and stuff like that. So I recognize that for some people, the 10% is hard to figure out, but I call it a tithe. I was overseeing the stewardship aspect at All Saints Pasadena. That's a $5 million budget. $3.4 million of that was coming from pledging, from people's regular giving to the church. And one of the things that I did with the new members class, took an existing class and really emphasized when people made a conscious choice to join the church. Some people were baptizing, so getting baptized, so becoming Christians, but some were just claiming All Saints as their home. I really, really encouraged people to submit a pledge card when they did that, and gave them several opportunities and several pledge cards, no matter how many they already had. And I had a 90% return rate on that. 90% of new members would submit a pledge card. I've done the same thing where I am, and I'm very excited about stewardship. I'm also very excited about asking people who don't go to our churches to help us out with joint community efforts. There's a lot of wealth in this valley that could be approached for big asks. And there are a lot of people who don't personally feel deeply connected to God or Christ, who do feel connected to the idea of generosity and the idea of helping out in the world. How would I do it as the Bishop of ECR? I would work with Lisa Bennett, who's our Director of Development, and other people who are super excited about stewardship, and get other people excited about it too. It can be life-changing for people to get rid of that fear of not having enough money and to just let go of the grip of it. And when you see it happening at a church, when you see people just pouring money in the offering plate on Christmas Eve, for example, and getting energized about what just happened, you recognize that God wishes us to be generous financially.
Thank you, Janine. That ends the questions that we have. Timekeeper, do we have time for another question? Sure. We do. Anyone? Okay. I'll go with this young gentleman here.
I'll debate the young here. Follow up to your stewardship question. In working with the Latino community, stewardship can have a very different meaning. Money is hard, but time and talent are easier. Can you speak a little bit about the Latino community and stewardship and how that's different from our Anglo community?
So my experience is that in the Latino community, there are people all along the economic spectrum in the same way there is in the white, Asian, and African American communities. But if you want to speak about people who have less money to give, then what I would say is that stewardship can also include the sharing of your spiritual gifts, the sharing of your skills, and so on. And there are also people who have a lot of resources who can't share money because they're, say, taking care of a disabled family member or something like that. So it's always tricky for me to assume that somebody might be able to do something.
Or my comment was more that stewardship means steward means overseer, and it has the linguistic connotations.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, you're exactly right for the other side.
Yeah, okay.
But the connotations of stewardship come across different.
Okay, excellent point. So in general, when we are translating things, we have to think very much about the cultures, because there are many Latino or Latina cultures, and how they hear things like that. So what I would do is I would get people from that culture who are far more illiterate in that culture, who would help us develop materials. I would do the same thing for the Mandarin community and the Korean community and the Korean community, the African American community as well. Thank you, that's a great question.
Thank you. Do we have time for another one? Okay, well, the Reverend Mary Blessing.
Hi, you probably know that there are many congregations in El Camino Real going through transition, including our cathedral having a change. So with maybe 13, 14 different places looking for new priests.
Yeah.
And that's a huge amount of transition. So if you were to become our next bishop, how would you handle the movement that creates? What would be an effective way to
bring new people on board?
To bring a calm, clear presence for all of us.
Oh, okay, so there's two aspects of that. I wanted to answer another question. You want to talk about handling helping people to find peace during transition.
Yep.
Yeah. I think one of the ways that people, first of all, I have heard of some of these transitions, and in every case, people have been pretty happy with the leadership they've had. And when people are happy with the leadership that has been there, they feel pretty steady themselves. They are less likely to fall into an anxious phase. But I think that the other thing that could happen is when you have multiple churches in transition, rather than each of them engaging in a separate search process, you're doing the same job 14 times. Get those 14 churches together and have a huge conference for all the people. Because one of the things that we'll do is create connections between these people. There could be shared ways of doing things. It's quite likely that there's somebody who wants to move to this diocese and they're applying for multiple positions in the diocese. And there could be some sharing there about is St. Philip's a better fit for you, or St. James a better fit for you? No, let's talk about that. What would be the best fit for you? It would be kind of cool to think about sharing that. But the other question that I thought I was answering is that how do you recruit great leaders? And I think that we can do more than putting a job listing out on Episcopal News Service, that through lots of networks like the Latino Hispanic Ministries Network, the Asian American Ministries Network, of whom I know some of the leaders, that we can start bringing in a more diverse set of leaders, especially linguistically diverse leaders. That would be a tremendous gift to this diocese. The number one need I have in my own church, a Good Samaritan, is somebody who can speak Mandarin. I think 1/3 of my new members coming in are Mandarin speaking with very little English. They're coming to UCSD or San Diego as experts in some field, and they want to worship, and I can't speak to them, nor can the Asian members in my congregation, because they speak another Asian language. So we need this linguistic diversity in the church. I think recruitment will do it.
Thank you. And where are we, timekeeper?
What time are we ending this section?
7:20.
So we've got maybe two more minutes?
Not enough time for another question?
We do not have time for it.
No time for another question, but Janine Schenone, thank you very much for everything.
Thank you, Ian.